Hello, and welcome back to the next installment, video lecture number 10. And this lecture will focus on the executive departments that are made up of both departments and agencies. So the goal of this lecture will be to really study and learn a little bit about the executive departments and agencies that make up the federal bureaucracy. So let's get started. I hope you guys are comfortable and ready. Take some good notes. And again, please ask questions as we move along through this journey. So the executive departments of the executive branch. And here in the picture on the right-hand side, you can see the symbols of the 15 executive departments. And there's a really great chart in your book. Let me get the page number here. It is page, just a second, 198 and 199. You can see the name of the department, the year that it was created, the goals and functions of each of the departments. And so we'll be looking a little bit more into that and doing some kind of activity in class. But so if you do want to look at that, you can see these 15 symbols and the departments. So let's go into this. So what is the job, what is the role of the executive departments and the agencies? Well, they're there to assist the president and the president's staff in carrying out laws, proposing policies for new laws, issuing regulations that help the president faithfully execute the laws, and last but not least, connecting the executive branch to the people of the United States, to the various states themselves and the state governments, to various local governments. So the executive departments really carry out many of these functions. Really, their job is to assist the president. Again, remember, the president is one person. How can the president really effectively manage 2.8 million civil servants and be the president of 300 plus million Americans spread over 50 states and throughout the globe? So you can see that that job would be quite difficult for one person to handle. So this is really the role of the executive departments and those agencies. So if there are any questions, please let me know. Moving on, we're going to look at a term, bureaucracy. And here you can see this political cartoon on the right-hand side of your screen captures rather well, I think, the idea of bureaucracy. It's a French word that means office. So yet it's widely misunderstood by, I think, many Americans. And in fact, it often has a negative connotation attached to it. So what does bureaucracy mean? Well, we just said it means office. It's a place where people go and work. So you can see there's a series of desks, people seated at the desks in this office, a bureau in French, and people that work in the bureau are bureaucrats. And that's just the simple explanation of this term. So we have the federal bureaucracy, and again, the federal bureaucracy are the 2.8 million people that work for the federal government in various departments and or agencies. So why is the connotation of bureaucracy in the United States so negative? Well, that's a good question. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video lecture and answer that question to the best of your ability. You might want to talk to your mom or your dad, somebody. What is it about bureaucracy that just brings up sort of negative responses among people? So bring your answer to class and we can discuss that. However, and I think I have my ideas, but I'll share those in class with you. So let's go on to this idea of bureaucracy. We can say the following things about bureaucracies. They share common things, and you can see those listed on the screen. They have a formal structure. They also have a building that has lots of these offices in them. So each department has its own office building and space with offices and where people go and work. They have a division of labor. So the tasks and the jobs are divided up, and that's very common. That shouldn't be a surprise. And they also have a set of precise rules that govern the operation of the individual department or agency. So bureaucracies share all of these commonalities. So you can look at you can see the office there pictured and imagine that being reproduced for the 2.8 million federal workers in the federal bureaucracy. So I don't think there's really anything else to talk about, but we will talk about that answer in class about the connotation of bureaucracy. And you should try to connect it to what you know about politics today, the political divisions between Democrats and Republicans. I think some of that will help you. So moving along on our path, the federal bureaucracy. So you see a picture of the United States. You see really a picture of the world. On the left-hand side in blue, you see the United States, Canada, and Mexico. You also see the world because it's rather interesting. The 2.8 million workers that make up the federal bureaucracy, only 300,000 or so work in and around Washington, D.C. That means that there's some 2.5 million workers that are spread across 50 states and, believe it or not, 190 nations across the globe. So we can say this about the federal bureaucracy. It is a truly global organization, though it deals with the United States of America and our laws and our regulations, and it works for the president to help him enact those laws, to execute those laws, to study proposals, to interact with Congress, to interact with the public. But it is, in fact, present not only all across the 50 states, but throughout the globe. So that's a rather interesting idea. So, and as I've already stated, the top officials and leaders of each of the departments and agencies are all political appointees. That means the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints them to head up an office or an agency. And if you remember from a previous lecture, there are about 3,400 top officials who are political appointees. So that means the rest of the workers in the federal bureaucracy are lifetime employees. That is, it's their full-time regular job. Why do I say their full-time regular job? Well, the 3,400 political appointees serve the president, serve at the pleasure of the president. When the president leaves office, the incoming president will then have the ability to appoint new political leaders, secretaries, to head up these various agencies and departments. So the top officials will only be around and in their position as long as the president is in the position in office. But the rest of the workers, the vast majority of the federal bureaucracy workers, are career civil servants. That is, this is their full-time job. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of the history of the federal bureaucracy and some of the reforms, I think, in the next slide. And we can look at that, the history of the bureaucracy. Early on in the nation's in the history of the United States, pardon me for that, government jobs in the federal bureaucracy were handed out by presidents as political rewards to people who supported them during their election campaign and afterwards. And this practice became known as the spoils system. So the spoils system, a system by which a newly elected president would essentially appoint the people that helped him get elected, the people that were loyal supporters, and they were rewarded with these federal bureaucracy jobs. If you remember Marbury versus Madison, that Supreme Court case that established judicial review, Marbury had been appointed as a judge in Washington, D.C., denied his position, but early on in the nation's history, in the history of the nation, rather, having a government job was a stable and steady source of income. So these were important positions, but it didn't always mean that the best person got the job. It didn't mean that people were going to be efficient workers or that they were experts in their fields. So that was one of the issues with the spoils system. Now, Thomas Jefferson was the first president to use the spoils system when he replaced many of George Washington's Federalist bureaucrats. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was from a different party. So we get the early playing out of partisan politics through appointing workers to the federal bureaucracy. Andrew Jackson in 1829 replaced more than 2,200 federal bureaucrats when he took office, prompting a Jackson supporter by the name of William Marcy to say, and I quote, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy," end quote, which is sort of an old-time allusion to Roman practices, that when Rome conquered, they were able to take the spoils, the prizes, the goodies of victory. And so for a president coming into office to be able to appoint his people in the federal bureaucracy meant that the president was more likely to get his way, to get his agenda passed or acted upon. Now, the spoils system, however, came under attack in the late 19th century. Congress created the Civil Service Authority in 1871 to write new rules regulating the appointment of hiring federal bureaucrats. This commission, the Civil Service Authority, accomplished very little. It disbanded 2 years later, but in 1883, in 1873 rather, the Civil Service Authority disbanded. But in 1883, some 10 years later, Congress passed what was known as the Pendleton Civil Service Act, something I've mentioned in previous lectures. And the Pendleton Civil Service Act was civil service reform. It ended the spoils system and made the hiring and firing dependent on merit, not rewarding a person for their political loyalty. And you can see in this political cartoon to your right, two gentlemen applying to some position in the federal bureaucracy are being shown the door by the gendarme or by the policeman there, who's saying, look, you're not welcome here, or they didn't pass the exam. So the Pendleton Act created a process by which all federal bureaucrats were to be hired, and that typically involved a very rigorous and difficult civil service exam that all federal workers had to take. So the Pendleton Civil Service Act did great things in terms of attracting qualified people to serve in the federal bureaucracy to work for the government. And that law remains on the books, and the Civil Service Act was again reformed in 1978 with the Civil Service Act that created the Office of Personnel Management. And the Office of Personnel Management is the office that conducts the competitive examinations and runs the civil service for 2.8 million federal workers. There's also something called the Federal Labor Relations Authority that deals with worker complaints regarding unfair labor practices, and there's also something called the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board, U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board, that oversees all hiring to make sure that no political favors or favoritism occurs. We do not want political favoritism. We don't want nepotism, that is hiring relatives to positions in the federal bureaucracy. So what's happened over time is the U.S. government has gotten larger, and we know that it's grown very large to 2.8 million people. The jobs that the U.S. government does have expanded as society, as the economy, as the world has changed and become more complex and fast-moving with lots of parts, from finance to education to environment to, you name it, defense, the war on... Okay, so I got cut off there, but as the federal government grew in size and in complexity, so too did the bureaucracy. And so the idea was to attract the best people to the job. So that's the end of this lecture, and we're going to look at a couple of questions in conclusion. Is bureaucracy a good thing? I think that's a very good essential question. Why did Congress reform the hiring practices of the federal government? You should be able to think about that and provide some answers. And lastly, would you want to work as a civil servant in the federal bureaucracy? And how would you go about getting a job in one of the departments or agencies of the federal bureaucracy? So check out those questions, reflect on those questions, jot down some ideas, and bring those to class. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And as always, it's a pleasure. And if there are any questions, let me know. And we're going to march forward in the coming days into the executive departments and or agencies. Thank you very much.